Hi everyone, my name is Abdul Rehman, and you have watched our recent podcasts. They were related to the modern fiqh interpretations and Islamic modernism. So today we have Dr. Jawad Hashmi on a very similar topic of religious reforms and roles and responsibilities of citizens in modern nation states. Dr. Jawad is a certified board emergency physician and also a former member of the medical ethics at Harvard Medical School. In addition to his medical training, he holds a bachelor's and master's degree in Islamic studies and Arabic from UC Berkeley and Harvard. So his research works include the sanctity of life and the ethics of war and also the Islamic modernism. So our question today with Dr. Jawad is very similar to Islamic modernism. First of all, Dr. Jawad, thank you so much for joining us today. So the first question that we have is, I believe, very important that regarding that question, we face a lot of the problem is the modern nation states, like the situation of post-colonialism and the modern nation states. How does it differs from the previous situation of Hakim and Mehkoom, like the rulers? And how does the responsibilities and the rights of citizens differ from now and then in an Islamic perspective?
Great. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I wanted to add that I'm also, my main job right now, so to speak, I'm a PhD candidate in Islamic studies at Harvard University. That's where I study. One of the major topics is Islamic modernism and Islam and modernity. So I am in a PhD level. I'm not a professor, so you should just keep that in mind. So anything I do say would be tentative. As for your question, I think that's a very big and important topic that you've touched upon. What I would say is this: that in the pre-modern period, it was really the time of empires, which actually had very weak central powers compared to the modern nation state. So after the Treaty of Westphalia and the European nation state formed, and then the rest of the world kind of followed suits in some time, what you have is a lot of centralized power in the national governments. So we kind of think of today as, we all talk about rights and human rights and liberty and all this, but one of the paradoxes of modernity has been that the nation state has become so all-powerful, the state itself. So that realigns the relationship between the ruled and the ruler. So there is that aspect to it. Now, what I would say in the pre-modern period, what you have is you do have a state of, as you said, the ruler and the ruled, in the sense that the ruler has all the rights, and he derives those rights often from God directly, instead of, there was some concept in the Islamic societies of that there is this consent from the governed, but this is a very vague topic and it was never really fulfilled. But the point is that God himself is the one who empowers these monarchs, and you see this in Europe, you see this in the Islamic world. In the modern period, there is this push towards the citizens actually being the ones who give their consent to being governed, and the ruler is actually a part of that citizenry. So there's a divestment from the person of who's ruling. In the pre-modern period, the person who's ruling is often the one who is vested with that authority, whereas in the modern period, you see that it's the position of the ruler that is. So there's a difference between Donald Trump being before he became president and after he leaves office. Hopefully he leaves after this election cycle. But it's really the presidency of the United States that's important. That's where the power is concentrated, not in the personality of Donald Trump. So that's a difference between the pre-modern period and the modern period. Now, what you see happen in the Islamic world is that I think you have the combination of the worst of both possible worlds joining together in the modern period. So the advantage of the pre-modern period in the Islamic world was precisely that the ruler, even though in some sense theoretically he had this absolute power and there was no expectation of all these extensive basic rights that we take for granted now for the citizens, but realistically the ruler only had so much control over this far-flung empire. The further away you were from the metropole, the less control the ruler would have. So interestingly, non-Muslim populations, for example, in say the Ottoman Empire, would have much more autonomy than they would have in a modern nation state. So that was a positive thing of the Islamic past that is kind of eliminated once we have this adoption of the modern nation state. But instead of taking the positives of the modern nation state, which include those basic human rights, really what you see is this kind of combination of the totalitarian nation state with this kind of Islamist mentality, where you're combining kind of the worst of both, and that's what's happening. So there is an author, and I'll end it with that. I know it's a very long-winded answer, but there is this book called The Impossible State by Wael Halak. He's a scholar in the West. That's a really good read where he talks about this.
I think, you wonderfully answered the main introductory part. So, like, when we talk about the religious reforms in the terms of modern nation states as compared to the traditional concept of Islamic states, so would that differ or would they remain same? And what would actually religious reforms would mean in an Islamic state, let's say in Pakistan or in Saudi or any of the Islamic state?
Sorry, can you clarify just a little bit specifically what you're asking here?
So, like, religious reforms, when we talk about the religious reforms, what do we exactly mean by religious reforms in an Islamic state, like considering the traditional view and the modern nation states as we discussed in the first part? So how would we initiate, first of all, define the religious reforms, and how can they be implemented as well?
Okay, great. So I think we should define two terms. One, you asked me to define this kind of religious reform, and the other is, I think it's important that we define what we mean by an Islamic state. So in some sense, when we use this term Islamic state, it is very much a modern term. We're talking about an Islamic nation state. That is kind of, even though it's brought up by kind of Islamists and kind of religious right-wing sort of people, but not exclusively, of course. In fact, we're going to talk about that. But even though it's brought up in that way, in some sense it's a bid'ah, in the sense of blameworthy innovation according to their own methodology, because it's the combination of, it's a very new thing, as I discussed before. It's this combination of the post-Westphalian modern nation state with this kind of Islamism, kind of this, which leads to this religious totalitarianism. So that's what I consider to be an Islamic state, in nation state, that is kind of most commonly understood. However, I think it's important to point out that many Islamic modernists and reformists, especially from Pakistan and South Asia in general, but Pakistan in particular, have been arguing for an Islamic state that has a very different conception. And that's something that I think we should touch on. But the point is that the term Islamic state is very vague and needs to be defined, and different Muslims mean different things by it. So there are people who say that a country like, the Scandinavian countries can be Islamic states in some sense, that they follow the general ethical norms of Islam, even if they don't realize that they're doing that. That I've seen that usage before. And then there is the kind of Islamic state that Saudi Arabia or the Taliban, Afghanistan under the Taliban, is an Islamic state, or ISIS is an Islamic state. So there's one of the principles of religious literacy is that every religious tradition is made up of a vast diversity of normative claims. And so it's important to note that Islamic state, there's not just one conception of that. So as for your second question about religious reform, what I would say is, there's always been this concept of Islah in Islam, which is reform. But I would say that, again, this also means different things to different people. So even though an Islamic traditionalist, a conservative Islamic traditionalist, could use the term Islah and reform, as well as a Salafi, a Wahhabi, could also they definitely use that term as well. But what they mean by it is vastly different than what a liberal or modernist Muslim is meaning by that term. So I would say that, yes, Islah has a historical usage, but in the modern period, it takes on a greater sense of urgency, and you mean something quite more, something much vaster and all-encompassing when you mean reform. So just the same thing like the word ijtihad. In the past, it meant something very narrow. Now when people often use the word ijtihad, they're talking about something quite more radical. So I think it's important to clarify that.
Okay. So yeah, I would move to Rahat for the question.
Sure.
Yeah. So thank you, Jawad, for joining us. And I was looking at your profile. By profession, you are a physician, and then you are also interested in religion, and not even interested, but you have done your bachelor and master's in theology and Islamic studies. So my background is engineering, and I also have interest in religion. But like thinking of going into the religious studies at this stage is a bit like impossible for me. So I just want to know about a bit of your journey and shed some light on it, like, and then we will come back to the topic. I have a follow-up question on what you said, but just for the purpose of information.
Sure. So thanks for that, Rahat. So it's interesting that you did engineering. Can I ask what type of engineering you do?
Yeah, I did master's in electrical engineering.
Okay, nice. So I actually did study 2 years of electrical engineering, computer science. But it was not for me. So that's actually what I started with, was 2 years of electrical engineering, computer science. So just like many South Asians, Pakistanis, my parents were immigrants who came to the United States. I really had only two options that were viable to me at that time, which was engineering or medicine. So I actually started with engineering. I didn't really like it. And then I switched to medicine. To be honest, I pretty quickly realized I didn't like that either. But by now it's too late. So kind of the same way that you were thinking, Rahat, I said, oh my God, there's too much sunk cost in this. But, growing up in the US, one thing that you learn, which is a very positive thing, I think, of the mentality in the US. So when I went back to, when I would go speak to like Pakistani friends, they would say, oh my God, you wasted 2 years of your life studying engineering and now you switched to medicine. Whereas you would never hear that by an average American would not say that. They do, if you look at them, they do many different things. At age 50, they'll suddenly change course and go back to school and do something totally different. So, I'm very grateful that I've had the opportunity to, even though it's later in life, the thing that I thought about. So now I went back to complete a bachelor's and master's, and now do a PhD in Islamic studies. All in all, it'll take another, pretty much a decade to do all of that. But the thing that I kept thinking to myself is, I'd heard someone else say this, they were going the other direction. They were going from one career path to becoming a physician in their late 40s. So by the time they graduate, they'd almost be hitting 50. And then what that person said really struck me. They said, well, how old would I be in 10 years if I didn't do this? So that's what I thought to myself. How old would I be in a decade if I didn't do this? And I'd be the same age. So I think that's a good mentality to do. I don't think in life if you were meant to do something, you should do it. And just because you're so old now, in retrospect, when you look back on your life, I think you're going to realize that you weren't as old as you thought you were. And the last thing I would say on that is, my father, he's an engineer, an electrical engineer, and he ironically wanted to be a physician. So I think vicariously I became a physician. And at that, he could have gone into med school. He was very intelligent, had excellent grades, but they decided against it, my parents, because they thought 4 years was too long. And now he looks back on it and he says 4 years would have been nothing. So that's the kind of thing that I think about. So yeah.
It's a struggle in South Asian communities, but it's a huge step. Like if you take what you want. So your interest in religion just brought you toward your studies in theology and Islamic studies. Why you chose Western school? Like being in a Islamic communities and Muslim communities, that if you are going into a Western school to study Islamic studies, you are considered to some extent an outsider, a foreigner. your commentary or your is not considered kind of valid, or the people will not accept it wholeheartedly at large. So why not a Islamic traditional school rather than a Harvard or UC Berkeley?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and that is something that I thought deeply about. I did consider studying. I mean, I have taken 2 years of coursework through Al-Azhar University, and I did find benefits in doing that. But ultimately, I decided that that environment was too intellectually stifling for me. And in fact, at one point in time, this was a long time ago, I applied to the Islamic University of Medina, which is a very conservative Salafi institution. At that time, I was much more conservative than I am now, but not as conservative as they are there. But the point is, I was open to that. And I do see a benefit to studying in that route for some of the reasons that you mentioned, but also they do have their, each side, Islamic studies in the West and traditional Islamic studies, they both have their pros and their cons. So I definitely see the pros of studying in the traditional routes. But when I applied, I got rejected, and many other candidates with less qualifications got in. And I was told that they don't want somebody who has already studied so much and has their own views. And that kind of tells you something about the selection process that goes on in these institutions. So there's a pre-selective process. And then you have to study there for 5 to 10 years. And during that time, they're going to, either one of two things is going to happen. Either you're going to change your own views and go along with what they're saying if you want to survive, or they're going to kind of get rid of you in that process. Even if you end up graduating, you like kind of lay low and you graduate. Even if you graduate and then you start saying stuff that veers away from kind of the orthodox opinion, then they will kind of distance themselves from you afterward. So they really, you won't have that. I mean, you could say that it's beneficial in a branding sort of way, that if you say, I graduated from Al-Azhar University, that gives you some branding and street cred amongst average Muslims. But if then they're going to anyways brand you a heretic and a kafir after the fact, then I don't know how beneficial that is. But the more important thing is, I think for me, what I've realized is, I think a combination of the Western style and the traditional Islamic style is the best. And that's what I have done. So even though I've only studied formally in Western institutions, like I did say, I studied a couple of years, I audited classes through Al-Azhar University, and I've done other traditional Islamic studies. So I am trying to combine both. But what I find with the Western style of approach is, I think it's more critical. You're able to have a freer mind. There are cons of it in the sense that they kind of don't like when you're trying to do some constructive theology. However, there is a new trend in the West that me and some other people are trying to start, which is this kind of Islamic academic theology, which people have been doing for a while but haven't had a name for it. But really, it's where you take this Western style, this Western research style, and you apply it to theology and see what results from it. And this is a long tradition. So most famously, Professor Fazl Rehman, who was a professor at University of Chicago, not Maulana Fazl Rehman, by the way, not that. He actually tried to bring this to Pakistan, but eventually he got expelled, or he went into self-exile because the extremists, the fundamentalists kind of turned against him. But that's exactly what he was trying to do. He was trying to combine both of these together. So that's my very long-winded answer. I'm sorry for these long-winded answers, but these are very long questions.
Those are like the basic question that I had in my mind, because like if there are a lot of people who got stuck in the engineering and medicine, and then they want to go out, but then they don't have an option. Like, okay, in the same way, like the Salafists are the one who are against Taqleed, right? They don't want Taqleed. But then again, they are the one who are opposing criticism. So as you said, that okay, it's kind of hypocritic, but it's how we are stuck in this whole situation. I'll come back to the topic And as we were discussing the religious reforms, so in democracies like Pakistan and Malaysia and all those Islamic countries, uh, how the religious reforms will work, like whether it will be the people who will select the candidates, and then they will go to the parliament, and then they will constitute bodies, and Pakistan have the Islamic Ideological Council, and then they will do the reforms like ijtihad and the modern issues. So that's one way of looking at it, because in democracies, it's the people who are actually the source of the change. While in cases of minorities, where Muslim are in minorities, like India, so we had the issues of talaq and all those kind of issues can nominate their candidates. So what's the way of religious reforms in those societies and also in Western societies? But like if I have a mortgage issue, so whether to check whether mortgage is fit the Islamic rules or not, I have no lightning that, okay, where should I go? So just considering both the options or both the scenarios, and just I'll give you a take on that.
Great. So those are, again, some very big questions. So just cut me off if I ramble for too long, which I tend to do. So for the first question, as far as where does reform take place? I think, again, it depends on who you ask. If you ask for my opinion, how it should happen, for what I'm trying to engage in, I think this happens right now. Where it is happening is in Western-style universities, in Islamic studies departments, because that's where the freedom of thought exists. So the freedom of thought does not exist, to a great extent in much of the Muslim majority world. So you find that many thinkers have had to flee the country. With, like I said, Dr. Fazl Rehman, and now Mr. Javed Ahmed Ghamdi. So you have these great thinkers and figures who've had to flee. And where do they flee? They usually flee to the West, because there is this idea of freedom of thought and freedom of religious expression there. As far as the Islamic, these state institutions, some of them are state institutions, some of them are quasi-state institutions, and you mentioned a couple of them in Pakistan. This is something that I think we have to be a little bit cautious of. What I would say is that Islamic modernism in Pakistan has had a difficult relationship with authoritarian. They do have what I'll say is they do have a little authoritarian streak in them, and the reason is they want to kind of fast track their religious reforms through a top-down approach, and that is problematic. I'm sympathetic in some sense, because I feel that same frustration, and the idea is that the masses, the awam, are honestly, to some extent, religiously, and this is not just me who's saying this goes back to Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, this recognition that the masses to some extent are religiously fanatical in some ways. So there's this idea that, okay, we can't trust them, so we need to have this top-down implementation. This has not been very successful, and in some ways, it's actually a little hypocritical, because it's basically an illiberal means to put forward a liberal ends. So it's a little problematic. What I think is probably the best route for us to go now, but it might be a little idealistic and naive, is I think reform should, so they, like I said, they're taking place in these Western institutions. What we need to do is establish Islamic institutions. And so this also is an idea that goes back to Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. So Sir Syed, he famously founded, Aligarh University, which was successful in teaching English Western sciences, but due to the right wing and the religious conservatism, he was forbidden from teaching on Islamiyat, like the Islamic subjects. So that, even though he and Aga Khan III, who was one of the financiers of Aligarh University, they wanted to create a faculty of divinity, a divinity school, that is a theological seminary, or more of a theological university. They wanted to found that in Aligarh, but they were stopped from doing that. That has been a continued dream of many Islamic thinkers, and it's remained unfulfilled. So even Professor Fazl Rahman, he wanted to do that, and then Javed Ahmed Ghamdi wants to do that as well. So I think we really need to establish that institution, and probably I think it's a good idea that we start by establishing that in a Western country like the United States, because otherwise we're always going to run the risk of getting shut down or taken over. So you see with, for example, like the Council of Islamic Ideology and these institutions that were in Pakistan, they were actually very reformist and modernist in the beginning of their existence. But then by the 1970s, but definitely by the 1990s, there was a rightward shift for certain reasons. So Fazl Rahman was, for example, was the head of one of these kind of institutions, and then later on, after he was thrown out, you see who succeeds these, and eventually you see now that they're quite conservative in their line of thinking, and that's due to external pressures. So where the reform needs to take place, I think we need to build the institutions. That's the educational institutions, and it's also the think tanks. That's where we start. And then we kind of spread our ideas out that way. And that's really the model that the Salafis have used, the Wahhabis have used. So they just founded, and the Deobandis, by the way, the ulama class in India subcontinent, Pakistan, India, Pakistan, they have thousands of madrasas that they've established, and they churn out their graduates. There's no way to compete with these. There, some 2 million of them that are in existence, like graduates. So I think we need to establish these institutions and start graduating students to kind of spread this kind of more open-minded thinking. So I think that's how we do reform. As far as using state institutions, I think that's a much wider conversation or a larger conversation that we're going to have about the relationship between religion and state, which is not very simple topic. Lastly, I would say, and I'll keep this really short, on the issue of like mortgage and Islamic rules, that's where I would say, and that's where I wanted to kind of modify the topic, that I'm not a fiqh specialist. Like I don't focus on Islamic law, understood as Islamic jurisprudence, fiqh. And that's not even just a lack of specialization in it, it's almost due to my thought and methodology, is that I think we should move away from this conception of Islam as law and move towards Islam as ethics. And actually that's consistent with the view of Islamic modernists for several decades. So I'll leave it at that.
So, Dr. Jawad, you just discussed about the Western research style, right? When you were talking about your education, that you also took some courses from Al-Azhar, but you applied for Harvard and UC Berkeley. So, talking about the Western research style, considering Islamic studies and Islamic education or Quranic education, right? Why there is less tolerance when we talk about Western research style towards Quranic studies? Like, if I'm in Pakistan and I would say to someone very orthodox or some traditional religious person that we should study Quran as a Western research style, like we study sciences. So why it hasn't been studied like the other sciences?
So correct me if I'm wrong. Your question is, why has there been so much pushback against applying Western styles of, or really what we can say is modern styles of research to the Quranic sciences? Is
exactly. Exactly.
Well, I think the reason for the pushback makes a lot of sense. Not that I agree with it, but I think I understand why the religious conservatives and traditionalists would be very apprehensive towards allowing such a methodology to creep in. And the reason is, such style of research is going to problematize many of the long-held traditional views. And it's not just on the particulars, it's actually on the overall religion or overall view. So that's going to be a strong challenge against Islamic traditionalism. So on a very basic point, for example, it's traditionally been the case that we say that the hadith explains the Quran. And if there's a hadith that's more specific on a general or vague Quranic verse, then we look at the hadith to clarify what the Quran says. But I think from a Western style, that is not the case, because we are skeptical or critical of the hadith as far as whether they authentically represent the words of the prophets. I would say that the vast majority of people would not have that view. Now, that's not to say that we throw the hadith away entirely. In fact, from a Western standpoint, that's a very powerful reservoir of information to use, but it's not historically dated back to the life of the Prophet. Now, there's an ongoing debate about that, but the point is that the hadith literature is full of historical anachronisms that make it very, very difficult to take that as seriously as the Quran, because the Quran is, even from a Western historical standpoint, it's the earliest extant text of Islamic history that we have. So we can rely on that. Whereas the hadith, much of what is in there doesn't line up with what we think happened in the early period. So the point is that this would cause a revolution in the way you think about Islamic thought. And of course, the traditionalists are going to be opposed to that, because it breaks, when we think about like Muhammad Iqbal's term that he used, the reconstruction of religious thought. Mm-hmm. What does reconstruction mean? Reconstruction means you knock down the building that you currently have. You use the same materials to reconstruct it, but you're first knocking it down. And that is what an Islamic traditionalist would not want to do. So they would want to preserve the tradition of Islam, which is built in a certain way. You could kind of, if the building is leaning in one direction, you could kind of try to add some layers in the other direction, but there's only so much you can move it. You can't change it from the base. If you change it from the base, in their view, the entire tradition collapses. So this is the reason that they are apprehensive of doing it, and I understand why they are, but I think that we have to do it, and the failure to do it will limit the scope of how relevant Islam can be in the modern period. That's my view.
Mm-hmm. So if I understand correctly from your answer, it's very similar to Imam Ibn Ashur's strategy. He said that we should be looking for a centrist approach between neo-literalism and neo-rationalism. But again, the point is that in living in Pakistan, or in a country where there are very traditional views about religion, it becomes very hard for a single person to come forward or to acquire knowledge in a very critical way, considering religion. Like it would be, again, very, you would be pushed by people. So how can we survive with a different approach towards religion in such societies?
Great, thanks. So what I would say is that I am not saying that we should strike a middle ground between tradition and, in the sense of how you worded it. I think you said the rationalist and the traditionalist viewpoint.
Yeah.
I would say this is the line that many Islamic reformers use today. So this is where I would part company, even though I have utmost respect for Mr. Javed Ahmad Ghamdi. This is where I part company. I don't like striking compromises as much. I like radical reform, and I like being very clear and bold and staking my claim where I believe it is. So I'm very much all about embracing the rationalist past against traditionalism. Now, that doesn't mean that we destroy everything in our tradition, but I am very much on that rationalist side of the spectrum. And I think this is where you see a change in the discourse amongst Islamic reformers in Pakistan. So in the first few decades, and even before Pakistan, the modernists were much more radical. In the last couple of decades, you've seen them moderate their views considerably. And I think the reason for that is how strong the religious right wing has become and how dominant their paradigm has become amongst the masses. And the reason for this is number one, how successful they've been in establishing their madrasa system and infiltrating kind of the educational system as well, so that they're, our children in Pakistan, when they're growing up, they're indoctrinated in this, traditionalist mindset. So where I'm trying to, my intervention that I'm trying to make, I'm trying to revive the radical reformism along the lines of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. So I'm not somebody who's going to strike a middle ground. I'm going to come from the left, and that's the line. So I trace my intellectual ancestry from Sir Syed Ahmad Khan to Professor Fazl Rehman. And so that's where I'm taking off. But I respect somebody who would say, no, that's too radical. We need to go this more moderate routes. I would just have my differences of opinion on that. So
great, that answers that. So another question is like, you might be aware of, he's a Turkish columnist, Mustafa Akil. So he recently posted on Twitter, I believe, about, I don't remember, it's in Nigeria or somewhere, that someone, he was a singer and he was hanged for blasphemy. So the point is that there, the Sharia court hanged him, I believe, for the blasphemy. And in Pakistan recently, in Peshawar, you would be aware that the person was killed because of claiming that, for whatever the reasons, but he was killed right in the court in front of the judge and police, everyone. So we condemn that, and we know that that's not allowed anyway in Islam, or even not, that's ethically not good. But the point is that, on the other hand, in Nigeria, I believe the Sharia code hanged that man or the singer for committing blasphemy. So what would be the difference in these two? I mean, is it fine for the Sharia code in an Islamic country, or in any country where Sharia code can be, the Sharia law can be implemented, is it fine to hang someone for blasphemy?
So I believe you mentioned Mustafa Akil, right?
Yeah.
So his thought and my thoughts are very closely aligned, I would say. So he considers himself an Islamic liberal or a Muslim liberal, and I similarly consider myself an Islamic liberal in the philosophical sense. Both he and I are Lockean in the sense that we respect the philosophical and theological thought of John Locke, who started the kind of Western Christian liberalism or theological liberalism. So that is the line of thinking that both he and I want to see happen in the Islamic world. And that is premised on the idea of freedom of thoughts and freedom of religious expression. So that was John Locke. He wrote a book, a treatise called A Letter Concerning Toleration, which is very famous. And it's from that thought that we get this idea of freedom of religion in the West. And the idea that he had, and it was a theological argument that he was making, which many people don't realize today, is that to everyone considers themselves to be Orthodox. Nobody says, I'm heterodox, unless we're using Orthodox with scare quotes. In the sense of Orthodox means right belief. Nobody believes that I'm following wrong belief, right? So even the prophets, when he...
We'll continue from the from where we left. Do you want me to repeat that question again, or?
Yeah, you can.
So I was talking about the, it was an article posted by Mustafa Akil. It was about a man, a singer in Nigeria. I believe he, through his song, or I don't remember exactly, but they claimed that he committed blasphemy, and he was hanged by Sharia court, right? So that means that he went through proper procedure, legal law rulings in the Sharia code, but as compared to someone who was killed in Pakistan by someone, not by the state, and he was killed, he was murdered, right? He was not punished. So there's a difference. So does these two differences justify, or how do you find these two for the blasphemy in an Islamic state or in any of the country?
Okay, great. So I think we need to differentiate between the two in the sense that one is the question is, can the state enforce religious orthodoxy and punish the crime of either apostasy or blasphemy?
Yep.
And two is whether or not a vigilante can do the same.
Yep.
I think the reason why it's important to make this differentiation is to give credit where credit is due, in the sense that there are Islamic traditionalists who want to say yes to the former and no to the latter. What I will say is that that has its precedent in Islamic history. However, there also is the precedent in Islamic history of there being this idea that even though it's not legal for the vigilante to kill the apostate or the blasphemer, there have been no shortage of jurists who have said in the past that the person who does such a thing will incur no legal penalty for doing that, because the person who blasphemies or commits apostasy lifts the protection of the law from, so their blood is no longer haram. Their blood is licit. So even though it's not legal, it's kind of, you can think of it as a decriminalization of this crime. So that's why you see that Mufti Taqi Usmani, actually, in Pakistan, has, and other Deobandi ulama have turned a blind eye to, and even giving justification for vigilantes who take the law into their own hands and punish people who are accused of apostasy or blasphemy. And this is extremely problematic. Now, I should be clear that I myself, from a religious and philosophical standpoint, do not agree with any laws against thought. So I don't believe that it is or religious expression. So I believe in complete freedom of thought and complete freedom of religious expression. And so you did mention Mustafa Akyal, who he and our thought lines up pretty closely. He and I both respect an English philosopher, a Christian philosopher, by the way. His name was John Locke. He is considered the father of liberalism, but really what many people don't know is that he was a deeply religious man, and his arguments were grounded in his theology. So he grounded his arguments in the Bible as well as in natural law. Similarly, I would stake my claim and my beliefs in the Quran. So I think, as a person who specializes, one of my specialties is in Quranic studies, reading the Quran, what becomes very clear to me, and this is part of my dissertation, is that, we all know that there's this verse in the Quran, let there be no compulsion in religion. But I don't think that this has been properly appreciated by Muslims or even non-Muslim scholars. I actually now believe, because my dissertation is on the topic of jihad in the Quran, I realize that the entire justification for jihad in the Quran is rooted on this idea of fitna. And fitna is religious oppression. What was happening was that the early Muslims were being persecuted as apostates. They were being persecuted because they left the religion of their forefathers for this new religion. And so they were being persecuted for that. So the Quran said, fight them. That is, it's justified to fight them back, to defend yourselves, until there is no more fitna, that is religious persecution, and until religion is for God. That expression, religion is for God, is very similar to the Arabic saying that, sorry, it's slipping my mind the exact phraseology, but basically it's the idea that the nation state should be distant from, it has no right to rule over a person's personal religious life. So you're actually seeing this idea in the Quran. And so I don't think that this is a modern viewpoint. I think this is actually what animates the Quranic discourse on jihad. Now, it was later abandoned because then Muslims became the central power. And so, like many other nations and like many other peoples in history, as soon as they attained power, Muslims reversed this. You see this with Christianity. When Constantine became the emperor, he was an emperor and he became Christian, all of a sudden Christians went from being a persecuted minority to being the persecutors. Similarly, Muslims early on, they recognized that religious persecution is wrong and that apostasy from the forefather religion is okay because this is what you believe. Once Muslims became the majority, in due time, this idea was abandoned. And then there became this idea that, yes, we can use the force of arms and the force of the state to do religious bidding. But I think this was an error that was made. And so I think we need to reverse this in the modern period.
Mhm. I think, yeah, that completely answers the question. So I would move to Rahat if he has any questions, because
I I think that, yeah. So that again, my um, we have this concept of taqleed, right? That okay, you don't have to do any criticism on what has been settled out in late 10th century, and then we have those different school of thoughts like the Hanafi and Maliki and Hanbali and Shafi. So why it happened that okay, that specific era is defining the rest of Islam, like is defining Islam for the rest of the time that's coming until now. So why we just stick to that period and say that okay, this is now the end of the reforms, and we don't have to do anything beyond that, and we have to stick to those four schools. That's my question.
So what I would say is that I think we need to push back against this idea that it always was like this and that's the way it is now. And that's why one of my interests is Islamic intellectual history. And I did teach a course recently on this. And one of my motivations behind this was to show that in actuality, the traditionalists today are only following yes, they follow the Islamic tradition in many ways, but it's a very constrained interpretation of what that tradition is. In reality, when you study Islamic intellectual history, what you see is that there was a great diversity of religious thought and opinion. In fact, it was greater than what we have today, to be honest. And so I think that I would problematize that view that there is a model that we can just blindly follow today. Because when you're doing that, you're actually deciding what to follow and what not to follow in this kind of imaginary model that we've constructed of the past. So now, keep in mind that all Muslims, whether they're modernists or traditionalists, will look to the early period of Islam, which is kind of a sacred history, you could say, and use that. Like, for example, I did in my argument right now for religious freedom, I invoked the early prophetic period to justify my ideas. So we all will read into that early period different viewpoints because we will read it in different ways. So I think we should problematize that viewpoint. Now, as far as the idea of taqleed, yes, I think that's also something that we should push back against. And even more than taqleed, I think ijma is something that we should push back against, which is this idea that once a previous generation comes to some sort of consensus, then we cannot change those things. And again, what you see is a very selective process by which traditionalists will use this as they see fit. And they will imagine an ijma where there might not have been an ijma. And so you see all sorts of examples of this selectivity. So just to give one example, there was this idea that when a Muslim woman in the Hanafi madhab gets, her husband becomes missing, she's not allowed to remarry, even if he's been gone for many years and he's presumed to be dead. Now, what was happening in the colonial period was that many Muslim women decided then, okay, I will renounce Islam, I will become non-Muslim, then this will invalidate my marriage, and then I can marry someone else. This is what they were doing. And some of them would reconvert into Islam, but they would say, become apostate first, and then they would marry someone else. Now, what the ulama did was they realized that this is a problem, and so they rightfully said, no, let's change this Hanafi viewpoints and they took the Maliki viewpoint instead and said that I think it was 4 years or something. I think if your husband is missing for 4 years, then you can get remarried, and we can consider him probably he died. Now, and then they also said, interestingly, that your renouncing of Islam would not nullify your marriage. Why did they do that? They did that to stop women from doing that. But you could say to them, but there's ijma. I mean, this is taqleed. That why aren't you doing taqleed here? So you see that even they realize that sometimes you have to change things as they were done in the past to deal with new circumstances that come up. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, so, okay. And one follow-up question on freedom of expression and freedom of thought. So even in Western countries, like with everything happening that you cannot even talk about, like previously it was just anti-Semitism, but now you cannot talk anything, like you cannot talk about LGBTs, you cannot talk about minorities. And the right has if Trump has been elected, I think one of the reason is that the people have been banned from freedom of thought and freedom of expression, and Trump just say whatever he wanted, and then the people like it somehow. So isn't it like there is some kind of de facto or undefacto freedom of thought uh, bans or restrictions here in the West as well? And in our country, the people are mentioning those things as well, that, okay, there is no absolute freedom of expression in the entire world.
Yes, so this is an argument that is raised, and you can even come to the example of some European countries who have legal restrictions on, for example, in Germany, of denying the Holocaust. So you can face legal ramifications for that. And that is, I would say, and some countries have bans on racism as well, like outright racist statements can get you into legal trouble. What I would say the difference here, though, is I don't think we should strike a complete moral equivalence between these two, because in none of those countries are you going to be killed for what you say. Mostly you'll face financial penalties, not more than that usually. I don't even think you would get imprisoned for any of those things. However, what I would say is that I would want to follow a more American style, where in the United States there is a respect for freedom of expression. Now, any system that you put in place will have imperfections. There's no way that a perfect system has ever existed. Think about any Islamic traditionalist, ask them to bring up an example of a perfect Islamic state. They will not be able to do that, even if you go back in Islamic history. So even if you look at the period of the Rashidun, there would be times and examples and episodes that you could say did not meet up to the expectations. So there's always going to be imperfections, and I don't think that that defeats the overall idea. The second thing I would say is that, in my view, look, I'm not somebody who feels good when I see the prophet or religion being blasphemed. In fact, when I watch Western television, I am deeply disturbed by the way they talk about religion, God, and these things. These disturb my sensitivities a lot. And I think they have a damaging effect on the social fabric of society. So I'm not looking to live in a world where this becomes commonplace like it is in the West. However, I think the solution that the Islamic world should use is that, just like those examples that you mentioned, I think there should be a social taboo against expressions of blasphemy. And what I mean expressions of blasphemy, I mean outright blasphemous stuff. The problem with blasphemy laws is that there's a slippery slope. If there was if I was in Pakistan right now, and I can foresee that in 10, 20 years, as my ideas get more widely known, I could easily stand to, against accused of blasphemy. Right? If I say certain things, they could claim that I'm doing blasphemy against the prophets, even though I'm not. But they can easily spin it that way, and you see this happening. So that's the danger of having these restrictions on freedom of expression. So what I would want to see is that we have a social taboo in a religious society against saying these things. And I think you could even have, for example, like in America, you can't just on these regular regular TV channels, you can't just have nudity, for example, on like, you can't have that like in the regular TV channels that you have. You can't have, back when I was a child, you couldn't even have the kind of foul language, sexual innuendo. These were things that were not allowed. If you use these things on your TV show, you'd be taken off of public access. Then somebody would have to buy you on a special package that's like cable package, So I think societies can have these soft forms of control And I don't think there's a problem with doing this in certain ways, but I am against kind of a hard decriminalization. Hard criminalization of blasphemy, and I think that has a weakening effect actually, because I've noticed that many, I lived for 5 to 6 years in Pakistan, and what I would say is that the religious thinking, it's not very sophisticated because they're not able to, they're not used to their religion being under constant attack like I am living in the West. You'll see this with minorities. For example, if you ever, and I'm not trying to get sectarian here, I'm just trying to show that I've seen many debates between an average Sunni and an average Shia. You will notice that most times the Shia can take the Sunni to task. If you see an average debate between a Ismaili Shia and a Twelver Shia, the more mainstream Shia, usually it's the Ismaili Shia who will take the Twelver to task. If you see a debate between Ahmadis and an average Sunni Muslim, you will see that the Ahmadi will win. Why is this? The reason is that the minority is always used to getting their ideas attacked, and that strengthens them, because then they learn to problematize all their viewpoints and come up with stronger arguments. So this was an idea that John Stuart Mill came up with, and Sir Syed Ahmad Khan did too. In his, Sir Syed had an article in which he talked about freedom of expression, and this was exactly his justification for it. He said, for us as Muslims to be strong in our viewpoints, we can't restrict freedom of religious expression and thoughts and attacks against Islam intellectually, because then we will become weak intellectually. And by the way, and this I'll close with this last point, in the modern period, with the internet and the age of information, there's no way to stop this flow of information. So even from practical standpoint, if you wanted to do it, you can't do it. You would fail. So Pakistan can persecute a poor Christian woman who is supposedly accused of doing something. All that does is make Islam and Muslims look barbaric and do a disservice to Islam. But that doesn't stop Islamophobes and anti-Muslim ideologues from using the internet to attack Islam. So I think it's counterproductive, even if you were just looking from a tactical standpoint. So that's my view.
Mm-hmm. I think that answers every question. Thank you so much, Dr. Jawad, for joining us today and giving your precious time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated it. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.